Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Lyn Bartley, your host for today's show, and I'm here with two of our regular viewmeisters. We haven't used that description in a while. I want to get it back. Ron Kramer, who is the director of the Criminal Justice Program at Western Michigan University in the Sociology Department. And Don Cooney, who is in the School of Social Work and City Commissioner. And as we all know, but our audience may not know, we've been framing many of our discussions in terms of four crises: the ecological, the economic, militarism, and democracy. And since we are going to be talking about the 10th anniversary of the war in Iraq, I thought we might begin by examining some of the major issues related to the war and the kind of reflect on the anniversary and the kind of militaristic approach that we have in terms of our imperialistic intentions. So, Ron, you want to begin us on this topic today?
Well, one point I'd like to make is that it was because of the Iraq War that I started to participate in this program.
That's right.
You guys had already started, and I was doing research on the impending war. The war hadn't started yet, so this would have been the fall of 2002, and you invited me on as a guest, and I came on and talked about the war, the coming war, and you said, "Well, come back next week," and then I came back next, and then I just kept coming. So
it just shows how wise we are in our
decisions.
decisions.
You're not kidding.
You couldn't get rid of me.
You doubled your salary.
Well, I started looking at the war as a criminologist, and as a criminologist, I focus on state crime, government crime, and corporate crime, and the way in which there's an intersection between the two. And in talking about state crime, we often use international law as our kind of broader frame of reference. You can't just use the domestic law of one particular country to talk about illegal state action, so you need a broader legal framework. Some scholars go outside of the legal framework entirely, talk about things like blameworthy social harms or human rights violations. I've always tried to frame my work within a broader legal context, and I was certainly able to do that with regard to the Iraq War. So there were a number of different crimes that were committed by the Bush administration. And the most important one is that the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003 violated the United Nations Charter. The UN Charter, as everybody knows, came into existence after World War II. And part of the reason that the UN was created was to respond to the wars that we had been through in the early part of the 20th century. And basically we were saying, no more war, never again war, right? And Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter basically prohibits the use of force in international relationships. It says you can't do that. You can't fight wars, you can't use military force, except for two fairly narrow exceptions. One is that if you're under attack yourself, direct attack, you can respond. You don't have to be defenseless. You can, if you're under immediate attack, you can respond. But even then, it's limited only until the UN Security Council can get its act together and respond to the aggression. So that's one circumstance, self-defense. Clearly did not apply in the case of the U.S. in Iraq. The second is if the Security Council feels that there is something out there that's a threat to world peace and security, they can come together and label that as such and work to resolve that situation. And they have a whole variety of non-militaristic ways to try to deal with that, political and diplomatic ways. If they have exhausted all of them, and they have to exhaust all of those other efforts, then and only then they can say, well, now it's okay to use all means necessary, which is the diplomatic code that you can use military force.
But the UN has to say that.
But it has to be authorized by the Security Council itself, and they can only do that after they've exhausted all of the other methods. Now, that didn't apply in this situation either. So those are the only two exceptions that are in the code. So the code basically says you cannot use military force. There's no justification for using military force unless it's for self-defense or if authorized by the United Nations Security Council itself. So In fact, the language that the Security Council uses here comes from the Nuremberg trials. If you remember, after World War II, we prosecuted the Nazi war criminals. They had engaged in a war of aggression. And so it said, you know, this is a crime against peace. That's the label that was created by the Nuremberg tribunal. And it called a war of aggression, a crime against peace, as the supreme international crime. This is the top crime that you can commit as a state. The supreme international crime is a war of aggression against another country that has not attacked you and for which there is no justification under international law for you to attack. So we committed that crime, the supreme international crime. Now, we committed a lot of other crimes as well that I'll get into maybe later on. We committed war crimes, that is, violations of another body of law called international humanitarian law, the laws of war. It might seem strange to some people, but the international community has devised a set of rules which you have to follow if you're engaged in a legitimate war. And so even if we were engaged in a legitimate war, which we were not, we also violated international humanitarian law in a variety of ways with the invasion of Iraq and the subsequent occupation of Iraq. So we violated that set of laws as well, another set of international laws. And then the third set of laws that we violated are domestic laws, which prohibit defrauding the Congress and the American public. There is a federal statute that says you can't engage in fraud against the Congress and the American people. Clearly, the Bush administration fraudulently led us into this war. They made a series of statements and claims that were clearly not true, and they should have known them to be not true. They've tried to hide behind, well, the intelligence was bad. Baloney. They knew quite well, and they misrepresented and manipulated the intelligence to try to present a case for invading Iraq, which turned out to be completely erroneous, completely false.
Yeah, right.
3 sets of crimes.
Yeah. You know, you began in the beginning, Lyn, by talking about the 4 dimensions that we were going to talk about, the issue of democracy, militarism, the economy, and environment. And I'm struck by how this war did tremendous violation to every one of those areas.
Right.
First of all, democracy, as Ron was just talking about, the lies, the deception of the American people, the manipulation of the public consciousness to frame this so that they could do whatever they wanted. And we know that the idea that the policy, that the media and the presentations were being fixed around a policy. It was the policy, they had already decided what they were going to do, and then they had to figure out how to deceive the American people to go there. And then the complicity of the press. The New York Times is the worst example of that, with Judith Miller and the others who were getting information from the Pentagon and not vetting it, just presenting that as fact. So the harm that was done to democracy by that war. And then the militarism, the enormous destruction, shock and awe. What that did to those people there. We don't know how many people were killed, but at the minimum number is 134,000 civilians directly killed, not to mention the others that were killed indirectly by the destruction of the water system and the sanitation system and the healthcare system. And then the displacement from all that, millions and millions of them displaced. So the militarism as an answer to what problem? We don't even know what problem it was. But the environmental damage, and we see that now in the harm that is done to the births, the children that are being born there through depleted uranium and white phosphorus and the other things that they used, the tremendous environmental damage that was done to that country. And finally, the economic destruction. Look, here we are now having these big arguments about the budget and how we're so far behind because this war, which cost at least $2 trillion, was done on a credit card. And now we get the bill. So I just think about what Jonathan Schell said in his article in The Nation, to look at, on the 10th anniversary, to look at the waste, the futility, and the shame of everything that we did there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea of the lies. I mean, I thought Phyllis Bennis in her article did wonderfully in describing, I think, non-existent links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, ties between Osama bin Laden and Hussein, invisible weapons of mass destruction, which certainly brought down Colin Powell, Baghdad's supposed weapons program, the lies about the uranium yellow cake, I mean, the aluminum rods. It just goes on and on and on. And how, I mean, as you're talking about this as a evidence of how the democratic process, which requires our being told at least a certain modicum of truth in order to operate, just simply distorted the picture. And then the press of the behavior of the press was absolutely reprehensible. Oh. Judith Miller's manipulation of the material that was published in the New York Times, and then the Keller, I think he's the chief editor, publishing something that someone described as an apology, and he said, no, it's not really an apology, it's just a description.
Yeah, horrible.
Where are we with it? It's just amazing.
I think it's important to go back and put all of this into the proper context, right? We have to remember that the September 11th attacks in 2001 created the opportunity for the Bush administration and the neoconservatives within the administration and the sort of nationalistic hawks within the administration to pursue a policy of American domination. Mm-hmm. So they had in their mind the notion that the United States had to dominate the rest of the world.
Right.
And with the end of the Cold War, right, with the end of the Cold War and what was now called the unipolar world, it was no longer a bipolar world, it's a unipolar world, and we're the one. Yeah. And we were going to dominate. And there was a kind of a broad notion of strategy here, international strategy, that the U.S. had to seize this opportunity. There was no other rival out there right now comparable to the Soviet Union, and we had to make sure that no other rival would ever arise. And we had to take advantage of this opportunity and use our great military strength to establish our domination, our strategic domination of the rest of the world. And what better way to do that than to attack Iraq, take out Saddam Hussein, basically gather control over the oil resources of the Middle East, take the pressure off of Israel, so to speak, by eliminating one of its chief rivals in the Middle East. And so there was this grand strategy, that we had this great power, we had to use this military power, and then we would reshape the world. Now, I have to say that, one of the architects of this was Paul Wolfowitz.
Yeah, right.
Okay? And Wolfowitz, I think, had somewhat good intentions, okay? In other words, he saw this use of American power as serving broader positive ends. We were going to be an empire. We were going to dominate the world with our military force, but we were going to do it for good reasons, right? We were going to create democracy throughout the Middle East. We were going to, we were going to be an empire, but we were going to be a benevolent empire, a good empire, right? Yeah. And we were going to do good things with our power. And so he saw this. But of course, to do this, we had to smash Iraq. We had to engage in an illegal war of aggression, and we had to use our military power. And in the process, of course, we killed probably over 1 million innocent civilians in Iraq when you add everything up.
Yeah.
So there's a great cost to this grand strategy that Wolfowitz is pursuing, but Wolfowitz definitely was the architect behind this. Now, Wolfowitz tried to present this strategy in a document in the first Bush administration back in 1992, Defense Planning Guide. And he outlined this grand strategy, and when it was leaked to the New York Times, and everybody was horrified. Oh my God, this guy's a madman. Or the people that wrote this are madmen for this is what the U.S. ought to do. And so the George Herbert Walker Bush administration disavowed it and backed away from it. And so, Wolfowitz and his people had to retreat. But they never really abandoned the grand strategy that they had of strategic domination and the use of military force for these positive purposes in their mind. And so, they operated through a number of conservative think tanks during the Clinton administration, right? And then you had the Project for the American Century, which was a think tank, and these neoconservatives like Wolfowitz and others joined in this, and they produced more documents about this grand strategy of domination. But they didn't really think they had any hope to ever implement it, right? Well, two things happened. One, the accidental presidency of George W. Bush. I mean, George Bush lost the election. He lost the popular vote. He probably lost the Electoral College vote, but the Supreme Court basically stopped the voting in Florida, gave the election to George W. Bush. So this is the first thing that allows the Wolfowitz plan to come to fruition. So now George W. Bush is president. He brings a lot of these neocons in, including some of the nationalist, hardcore nationalists like Cheney and Rumsfeld. So this is a bad combination, the hardcore nationalists and the neocons, and now they're in power. They still don't think they have a chance to implement this, right? Because George W. Bush isn't completely in their camp. Colin Powell is definitely not in their camp, and he's the Secretary of State. So they still need something else to happen. They need a Pearl Harbor. Right? They actually said that in their document from the Project for a New American Century. we need another Pearl Harbor to create the opportunity to allow us to mobilize the country to pursue this grand strategy. Well, they got their Pearl Harbor on September 11th, 2001, with the attack in New York and Washington. And in the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks, they were able now to take the anger, the fear, all the high emotions of the moment, and to utilize that to push forward their grand strategy. And of course, immediately they zeroed in on Iraq. Now, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11,
That's
right?
Right.
Absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. So they had to start making the case. So from the very beginning, the night of September 11th already, Rumsfeld has already written notes, try to connect this to Saddam Hussein, see if we can use it to strike Iraq. George Bush takes aside his terrorism guy and says, look into Iraq, see if Iraq was responsible for this. And Richard Clark was the terrorism expert. He had been for Clinton and now for Bush, said, well, of course he didn't have anything to do with this. This is Osama bin Laden, this is Al-Qaeda, that's what we suspect. We don't think it has any connection to Iraq whatsoever.
I just want to say, Ron, in the midst of what you're describing, there are now documents available with signatures on it, with notes on it, that illustrate what the validity, the truthfulness of what you're describing. So this is not a liberal's wish.
No, this comes from very well documented sources, from Richard Clark, who was the terrorism expert at the time. We have Rumsfeld's notes from that day. Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the chief assistant to Colin Powell at the time, also has confirmed all of this. So and we have other documents of conversations that went on between the British government and the U.S. government in the lead up to the war that documents this as well. So this is all thoroughly documented. But again, they saw this as the Pearl Harbor, as their opportunity to implement this grand strategy, and boy, did they jump at it.
And a couple things. What strikes me is I looked for, on the anniversary last week, the 10th anniversary, some mainstream newspaper to put all that together, just like you just did. But it didn't happen. None of the mainstream did. And what I'm concerned about is I asked my class last week, which is an undergraduate class, so what do you guys know about the war in Iraq? How old were you then? They said 6th grade. And then 9/11, okay, they would have been in 4th grade when that went. And they knew nothing. They didn't know. They thought Iraqis were on the planes that went into the World Trade Center. They didn't know why we went there, or they thought we were avenging 9/11 to go into Iraq. So I guess my point is, you would think that this nation would learn things from that. But unfortunately, it just goes down the what was the thing?
Memory hole.
Yeah, the memory hole, right? And just get rid of that. We don't think about that anymore. But it's so important that our younger people especially learn how we got fooled here, because we don't want to get fooled again. That just struck me so much.
And part of the reason we got fooled was because the media was not on top of it. It was in the lap of the administration, providing an echo chamber for whatever the administration had to say. So in some ways, it's that manipulation that kept some people from not knowing what was going on and not being able to make a judgment about how to respond to it. And when you think of what Congress did, I mean, sort of an indication of the amount of consensus that there seemed to be that this was what it actually looked like it was. I mean, I don't recall the exact votes anymore, but I think
Hillary Clinton voted for it, John Kerry voted for it, Joe Biden voted for it, all those guys voted for it.
And in this House, we had what, one person who voted?
Yes.
The woman from
California. She was my sister's congressperson. Yeah, so I remember that.
Now, the congressional authorization was not an authorization to go to war per se. What it was an authorization for the president to take all measures that he deemed necessary to protect the United States from the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. Okay, so it wasn't a complete, okay, you can do whatever you want to, but again, it was couched in the notion that if you could demonstrate that there is in fact a threat coming from Iraq, then you can respond to it as president. Now, two things. Number one, it's the Congress's constitutional responsibility to declare war.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The Constitution gives the power to go to war to Congress and Congress alone. There was much debate about this at the time of the Constitutional Convention, and it was very clear that most of the Founding Fathers, those men that wrote the Constitution, did not want the power to decide to go to war to be vested in one man, the President of the United States, because there would be too much temptation for the President to go to war under false pretenses and in circumstances that would not be approved by the country at large. So they said, look, it's far better for this power to be given over to the people's representatives, right? To the House of Representatives. The Congress has to decide whether or not we're going to go to war. It has to be a collective decision. It should be well vetted by the people's representatives, and it won't be the decision of one single person, right? Well, Congress has abdicated that responsibility over the years, right? It has given up that responsibility. We have now an imperial presidency, and the power of the executive has grown way, way beyond what the Founding Fathers would have ever accepted or wanted. And now the power to go to war is vested in one person, the President of the United States. And it's not supposed to be that way, but that's the way it is. And it's mostly by congressional abdication of the power that they possess. So that's one thing. So the Congress didn't do its job in this case on that score. But the second thing is they were pressured to produce this authorization. And so they did come up with something, and the Democrats are responsible for this as much as the Republicans, right? But again, they did couch it in, okay, well, you're the president, you're the commander-in-chief of our armed forces, and by the way, that's the only thing, that's the only phrase the only way in which you can talk about the commander-in-chief. The Constitution says, well, once a war starts, okay, the Congress decides when the war starts. Once the war starts, then the president becomes commander-in-chief, not commander-in-chief under any other circumstances. So we're going to tell you that, okay, if Iraq does pose a threat, then you need to have the authorization to respond to it. And that's what it says. But it still leaves a lot of ground for having to actually demonstrate that there is a threat. And this is where the lies come in, right? Because George W. Bush and his administration could not demonstrate that Iraq posed a threat, because it did not.
Right.
It did not have weapons of mass destruction. It did not. It did not involve itself in the 9/11 attack. It did not have ties to al-Qaeda. So, and Saddam Hussein was a monstrous person, and he had committed many, many crimes of his own. So let's get that right out on the table. He was not a nice man. He had done horrible things. He had done a lot of those horrible things when he was supported by us, by the way. Most of the charges against Saddam Hussein for using chemical weapons against his own people, we had supported him in his effort to do that. We had supported him in his attack of Iran, right? Iran was our enemy at the time, and Saddam was our friend, and we encouraged him to go ahead and attack Iran. And when he used chemical weapons against his own people for protesting that involvement, we stood by and supported him on that, right? So it's true that Saddam Hussein did use chemical weapons and some biological weapons perhaps on his own people, but he did it with the United States assistance and support at an earlier time. So Saddam Hussein is a monstrous person, but we helped to make him the monstrous person that he is. Now, of course, we've turned against him, and we're trying to tie him in with all these other things, but we have to demonstrate that he has those weapons now and that he's going to use them against us, and they could not demonstrate that because it wasn't true. And part of the reason, I mean, we knew it wasn't true. How could we, here in Kalamazoo, on this program, in Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War, how could we say so confidently that we knew that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction when the President of the United States and the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense are all screaming about this and saying that it's true? And yet we said it wasn't true, and we were right. We called it exactly.
Yes.
Now, how did we know that? It was not because we're any smarter, but because we were relying on evidence, right? We weren't relying on cooked up intelligence reports that were coming out or manipulated intelligence reports. We were looking at, for one thing, we were looking at the reports from the previous head of the inspection team that was in Iraq. This is Scott Ritter. Okay, now Scott Ritter, military man, Republican, had been part of the UN team that went into Iraq after the first Gulf War to disarm Saddam Hussein. And Scott Ritter said, we did it. We got rid of 98% of what Saddam Hussein had. He dismantled his nuclear weapons program. He got rid of the chemical weapons that he had and the biological weapons. We disarmed him. We were successful. Now, that inspection team eventually left. Okay, they were withdrawn because Bill Clinton wanted to attack Iraq at one point to bomb them in response to another incident. And so the inspection team was withdrawn. So there hadn't been an inspection team in there for a little while. So okay, maybe they've reconstituted their nuclear weapons program, right? Scott Ritter says this is impossible.
Yeah, they didn't have enough time.
They didn't have enough time. They didn't have the capability. Plus, we also had a high-level Iraqi defector. The son-in-law of Saddam Hussein had defected, had come over to the West. And he said, no, he doesn't have any weapons. He got rid of them all back after the first Gulf War. Now, we relied on a lot of other Iraqi defectors who were crazy, who were telling tales that were way out of, had no empirical evidence or basis whatsoever. But one of the highest-ranking people who did have the position to know what was going on, we didn't allow his testimony to become part of the public record.
I think he even told Bush that there was no...
Yeah. So, I mean, if we were reading Scott Ritter, if you were listening to the UN officials, if you knew about this Iraqi defector and his testimony, then you could be pretty well convinced that this was all hoopla, that there was no basis for this. Now, even if you weren't convinced, right? Even if you still, he still might have done it, that Saddam Hussein was a really sneaky guy. He might have reconstituted all those programs. He might have still posed a threat. Okay, let's send another inspection team back in there, right? Now, when this was first proposed, Bush and the other officials didn't want to do it, but eventually Bush went to the UN and they proposed this, and the UN went along. So Resolution 1441 was passed by the United Nations, and it established a second inspection team and would send them back to Iraq to search for the alleged weapons of mass destruction. Now, Bush thought, okay, Saddam won't go for this. He won't let him in, and then we'll have, then we'll have him, right? Then it'll be easy for us to justify the war, right? Because Saddam won't let the inspectors in to search for the weapons, and that'll be our cause, our case for going to war. Saddam surprised him, said, come on in. They did. So a second inspection team, this time under the auspices of Hans Blix, the Swedish diplomat, went back to Iraq. They were searching for the weapons of mass destruction. They were making regular reports to the Security Council, and they were saying, we're not finding any. It appears that the nuclear weapons program has not been reconstituted, that we're not finding any chemical weapons, and the reports from some of these other defectors are turning out to be false. We're not finding anything. And they were there. At the time that the invasion occurred, they were still there. They were still searching for the weapons of mass destruction. If that was the big issue, then why didn't we wait until the inspection team had the chance to complete their entire inspection? But no, we had to jump because the spring was coming, the weather was going to get hotter, they wanted to carry out the invasion, so they told Hans Blix, get out of there, we're bombing, we're coming in. And they did. So again, even if you weren't convinced that Saddam Hussein had gotten rid of all the weapons, if you didn't believe Scott Ritter in his report or his son-in-law defector's report, then now you had another source of data, of information telling you about those weapons in Hans Bleek's, and they short-circuited the whole process.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the book that I think tells this story very well is Hubris by David Korn and Michael Isikoff. And Rachel Maddow, on one of her programs, did an hour-long, it was really not just an interview with them, but documentary of showing where these people made these false statements. And that's an excellent summary of all what you were just saying, Ron. It was so clear. And then we have afterwards people like Lawrence Wilkerson and Hans Blicht coming forward and saying, you know, Wilkerson saying this was a huge mistake, terrible thing. We just made a huge mistake here. And Blicht saying, yeah, we didn't find anything, and they should have known. So the evidence is overwhelming, and the whole thing, we're stuck with it now. One of the things that really gets to me is that it's not over. And Amy made that point very, very well last week, Kathy Kelly made that point very well. I mean, they're averaging 18 suicides a day among veterans. 200,000 people have been treated. Of the veterans that have come back, there were 1 million people that went over there. At least 200,000 have been treated, mostly for PTSD. And the terrible destruction of that we never put back together. Unlike the Second World War, when we had a reconstruction plan, there was never a reconstruction plan for these poor people. So now we walk away from that and leave these people in their misery. And I think that's one of the things that just irks me the most of the whole thing.
Yeah. You know, the evidence that we're describing was there for people to see.
Absolutely.
And again, to go to the media for a moment, I found some quotes from Greg Mitchell's book, So Wrong and So Long. And he points out 16 different items from the press. I'll just do a couple of them, but they're so telling. Here's the day before the U.S. invasion, Bill O'Reilly is saying, if the Americans go in and overthrow Saddam Hussein and it's clean, he has nothing, I will apologize to the nation. I will not trust the Bush administration again, right?
Wow.
So then, more surprising to me, is Thomas Friedman, who had called this the war a legitimate war of choice, and now he wrote for the the New York Times, as far as I'm concerned, we do not need to find any weapons of mass destruction to justify this war. Mr. Bush does not owe the world any explanation for missing chemical weapons. What kind of thinking does it take how much denial do you have to be in to say something like that? And then the one I sort of like, because I listen to David Brooks occasionally and try to control myself. Brooks, Friedman, and Oliver North all came out against the surge in 2007 after it was announced by President Bush. George Will wrote a column entitled Surge or Power Failure, and after the botched hanging of Saddam Hussein, Kramer declared, we should not be surging American troops in defense of such a government. So there is some movement. But then Brooks, on Meet the Press, says he declares that there are 10,000 Iraqis a month who would perish if the United States pulled out. Bob Woodward, who happened to be on the show, challenged him on this, asking for his source. And Brooks said, I just pulled that out of the air.
Oh.
So if this indicates any kind of quality, and in terms of the information we're getting, and then who can forget Jessica Lynch?
Yeah.
What a public relations, if you want to see it from a perspective I don't believe in, what a coup that was for the administration to get people to believe that this heroic rescue was being made in the defense of democracy and freedom. Wow.
Yeah, right.
Terrible stuff.
So much lying.
Well, the rationales kept shifting, right? So
Oh, yeah.
first it was the weapons of mass destruction issue. That's the one they decided would sell the best. And challenged on that, then of course they also had the connection to terrorism and Al-Qaeda and 9/11. So they were kind of working these two things together, right? So Saddam Hussein supported Al-Qaeda. He therefore was responsible in part for 9/11. And because he did support Al-Qaeda, if he did have weapons of mass destruction, he could hand them off to Al-Qaeda. So the next time, it might not be flying planes into the World Trade Center. It might be the mushroom cloud. Condoleezza Rice used that expression. So did George W. Bush. So they're really trying to deliberately drum up the fear of the American people of another terrorist attack. And they're also trying to use the raw emotion, the anger, and the frustration about this attack to mobilize American public sentiment against the evildoers, right, as George Bush called them.
And the color coding that kept going on.
Yeah.
And of course, it was understandable why people were so angry and upset and fearful. But to manipulate that anger and fear when there was no factual basis to do so, to go after Iraq. Now, remember, we had already gone into Afghanistan, right? Now,
Yes.
I believe that the invasion of Afghanistan was also a violation of the UN Charter, that it was an illegal war of aggression. It had a little bit more of a veneer of justification, right? Because the Taliban rulers of Afghanistan had allowed Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to set up camps in Afghanistan and to operate out of there. So there was more of a veneer that this was taken in self-defense. Now, I want to point out that the Afghanis, the Taliban had offered to turn Osama bin Laden over to a neutral third party for him to be tried on the charges of masterminding the 9/11 attack. So they did threaten they weren't going to turn him over to us, but they would turn him over to a neutral country. So they were going to try to do something about bin Laden. But the idea that somehow only because of the camps in Afghanistan did that allow this attack? Well, they planned it in Germany and in the U.S. I mean, you know, Al-Qaeda, if it wanted to, could have planned this anywhere. It just happened that they had a few camps in Afghanistan, and Osama bin Laden was there at the time. But so again, they stretched that. There's an elasticity to all of this, right? So they stretched this to carry out this illegal attack. Right, they don't have any United Nations authorization to attack Afghanistan, and they don't have, it's not a response to a direct attack, right? I mean, they're not under attack at the moment that they have to respond by attacking Afghanistan. That's with the notion of self-defense. You're under direct attack right now. They're shooting at you right now. Not that it happened 6 months ago, and now you're responding, you're retaliating. You're not allowed to retaliate. You're allowed to defend yourself if you're under attack. So so again, a lot of people who later would oppose the Iraq War did agree to support the incursion into Afghanistan. But I see both of them as illegal uses of military power under the UN Charter. But remember, we were in Afghanistan, so now they basically want to divert away from Afghanistan and go after Iraq, so they have to connect Iraq somehow to 9/11. So they try to do it, and again, it was really ridiculous. If you knew anything about Islam or you knew anything about the politics of the Middle East, you would have known that Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, hated the Shiites, and that there was tremendous antagonism between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, and they never would have cooperated.
Right.
And some people say, well, if Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, he probably would have used them against Al-Qaeda first, right? Against Osama bin Laden. So to try to say that somehow then they were connected, or that Saddam Hussein would give over those weapons to someone who we also perceived as an enemy, just completely out of bounds. It just, was so ridiculous if you knew anything about the history and the context there. But they tried to use that. And then, of course, when weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorism failed, then it's a humanitarian project to bring democracy to the Iraqis, to respond to the humanitarian threat that Saddam Hussein posed, even though we helped to create him and gave him support to carry out some of those attacks. Now it's a humanitarian war, right? A humanitarian intervention is to bring peace and democracy to the Middle East. So they, when everything else failed, they went to that, and with some broader notion of American exceptionalism that we are the ones who are allowed to do this through illegal force, right?
Yeah. Could I, oh, go ahead, Don.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask if you would talk a little bit about the role of oil in all of this, because it's not, it's certainly something that was important.
Critical. Well, because that, of course, is the center in the world of the whole oil resources. And I think the idea was that if we controlled Iraq, we could control that whole region and get complete access to their resources, to their oil. And we seem to be negotiating. But the striking thing is, we ended up with very little of it. Mm-hmm. The Chinese and others, the British and others now, have probably more access to the oil than we had in the beginning.
Yeah, so oil is critical here, right? Iraq sits on the second largest known oil reserves in the world.
Yeah,
right?
next to Saudi.
So if the Iraqis hadn't had any oil, would we have gone in there at all? Absolutely not. I think everyone can say that with pretty clear confidence. There's no way we would have been interested in invading Iraq if they didn't sit on all this oil.
Right.
Now, did we need that oil for our own purposes? Not so much. What we did want to do, part of this strategic plan to dominate the world, we wanted to be able to control the lever of oil, right? If we control the lever, if we are in control of the Middle Eastern oil fields, then we can block the Chinese, we can block the European Union if we need to, right? We're in control. It's part of this broad scheme that Wolfowitz had for strategic American domination of the world. We use our vast military power, seize the Middle East, control the Middle East oil reserves, then we're in a tremendously powerful position to dictate the terms to dominate the world. And that's what they were interested in, world domination. I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's what they were interested in. And again, they thought they were doing it for good reasons, but because we were going to be a benevolent empire. Our imperial domination of the world was going to be good for the rest of the world, only the rest of the world didn't see it that way. And of course, it went horribly awry, right? I mean, that's the other thing about this. Their grand plan just completely fell apart because they thought, oh, this powerful military will waltz in there, it'll be a quick war, we'll take over, we'll get Saddam out of there, we'll establish our domination, and then all these good things are going to start to happen. Well, again, it totally backfired in their face because despite the enormous military power, they weren't able to overcome the on-the-ground resistance of the Iraqi people. They were not welcomed with flowers and candy, right? People don't like to be occupied. They don't like to be dominated. And of course, the strategic policymakers seem not to have understood the historic division between the Sunnis and the Shiites in Iraq or throughout the Islamic world. And what a horrible blunder to not understand that very important cultural factor about the region that you're hoping to dominate. And so, of course, we took out the Sunnis and Saddam Hussein, but that left the Shiites, who were more radical and more likely to be aligned with both Iran and with al-Qaeda, now gave them the opportunity to come to power and to fight. So what we did in Iraq was smash Saddam Hussein, open the doors for a protracted civil war between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and allow for retaliatory attacks to go on between the two. And we just opened up, a tremendous can of worms there that we were not able to control.
And also to enhance the whole situation with Iran. Iran now is very much a partner with Iraq in so many ways. Yeah.
Exactly. Shiite Iran and a Shiite Iraq, and we've empowered Iran and the mullahs in Iran by going in and disrupting Iraq and taking out Saddam Hussein, who was sort of a bulwark against the Islamic Republic of Iran. But that's gone now, and so again, it just so their plan, their grand plan, sounded so good on paper, but in the messy world, and they overlooked so many important factors, it just went horribly awry. To say nothing of the tremendous destruction. I mean, here's the criminality. The invasion of Iraq was a crime. It led to the death of over 1 million innocent civilians in Iraq. It led to millions more being displaced. It led to horrible diseases in Iraq because of the depleted uranium and the white phosphorus and the inadequate infrastructure and healthcare system. And it's just had enormously destructive consequences. And to say nothing of the 4,500 American soldiers who lost their lives in this war, and the thousands more who have been damaged by their participation in this war. Suicide is a major factor among the people coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq because of the horrible conditions of their service there. And to say nothing of the cost, you know, the $2 trillion, probably in the end it's going to be even higher than that, $3 to $4 trillion wasted, utterly wasted in this misadventure, and yet no one has paid any consequences. You know, I mean, arguably George Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, these men are war criminals. They planned an illegal war of aggression. It led to enormously destructive consequences and war crimes, the death and destruction of innocent civilians, all these other horrors, and yet they have not been held responsible in any way, shape, or form for the crimes, the criminal acts that they committed. And here we have to blame the Obama administration, right? Mm-hmm. The Obama administration did not do what it was required to do under international law, which was to investigate these illegal acts on the part of these former officials and to take them to the international authorities as they were required to do under international law. And they have not done that. So the Obama administration is aiding and abetting the other criminal administration by not prosecuting, not investigating, not doing what they're required to do under international law to respond to a clear act of international criminality.
Well, one of the things that strikes me about this whole thing is that they wrote down what they intended to do. I mean, anybody can go into the website for the Project for a New American Century from 1992 and read exactly their plan to do what they did. But it was probably one of the greatest blunders in American foreign policy history, I would imagine. Yeah.
I think in terms of the outcome, it is the greatest blunder, the greatest foreign policy blunder in U.S. history, because of all the consequences that it's had and is likely to continue to have in that region and in the rest of the world. So yes, and again, what I think a lot of people don't really appreciate is how the invasion of Afghanistan and the continued occupation there, and the invasion of Iraq and the long-standing occupation there, and the unsettled conditions that remain there, have generated enormous negative forces.
Yes.
And have created more people who hate the United States, are angry at us, are willing to engage in terrorist acts against our interests. Mm-hmm. We have created far more terrorism by going into these two countries than existed prior to 9/11, right? 9/11 was a drop in the bucket compared to the number of people who have anger against the United States and a willingness to engage in terrorism against the United States now. And so are we going to go around and kill every single one of these people? And this brings me to the Obama administration's drone warfare, right? So this is the cheap way to fight the war, to keep the war going. And to claim that we can use the drones, we don't have to invest our own troops now on the ground, we don't have to have boots on the ground, but we can use the drones and we can pick and choose which of these terrorists are out there and we're going to take them out. And so, but again, we continue to kill innocent civilians, which is a war crime, and the legal authorization to carry out the targeted assassinations through the drones is also very, very questionable under international law. It's probably also a violation of the UN Charter. So the Obama administration continues to engage in illegal actions and war crimes through the drone program in an effort to try to defeat terrorism. And of course, it only creates more terrorism. And why someone who's as smart as Barack Obama cannot see that this continued involvement in the Middle East in these ways through the drone warfare program in Afghanistan and Pakistan doesn't create more terrorism, create more problems for us down the road. How they can't see that is really beyond me. I think the answer is that they got so tied in during the first political campaign that Afghanistan was the good war, Iraq was the bad war. We're going to keep fighting the war in Afghanistan. We're going to get out of Iraq, and we'll keep the Afghanistan war going, and eventually we'll get out of there, but we'll use the drones as sort of a substitute then to keep the lid on things. I think they got so invested politically in that for both political campaigns in 2008 and 2012 that now they're so tied into it that they can't back out of it.
Yeah. I'm wondering, one of the points that Bennis makes is that one of the hopes would be that we would leave behind a pro-U.S. anti-Iranian government in Baghdad, and that certainly has not been the outcome. She points out that the Prime Minister al-Maliki is barely on speaking terms with anybody in Washington, D.C., so it's another failure in our effort to engage in this kind of imperialistic effort at tremendous cost financially to our country, and as you're pointing out, to American GIs who've come home wounded, and PS, the post-traumatic stress syndrome business. It's just, how long will we pay this price for this kind of foolishness? And it's really probably for another program, but I am also concerned about the internal security issues that are at stake with our being in this hyper kind of paranoid position of that information will always be able to be gathered so that we can find people whom we can blame for their cooperation and what we're doing to people who are calling the government on its activities is something to be afraid of too.
I remember how when we were organizing against South Africa, the South African government had a program called preventive detention, where they could put in jail somebody that they suspected might be going to commit a crime. Mm-hmm. I think we're not far from that in some of the legislation that has gone through in the past year. Just scary that they can put people in jail just about any time they want.
The erosion of civil liberties flowing from the September 11th attacks and then the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are just enormous.
Yeah.
I mean, the Patriot Act was passed immediately after 9/11, and Guantanamo was set up, and just, I mean, talk about maybe it's not the erosion of civil liberties, the demolition of civil liberties in the United States, all in the name of fighting terrorism.
Yeah.
And so many people, still cowed by the fear and the anger over 9/11, are willing to go along with this demolition of our civil liberties and our right to dissent. And we're giving away a lot of our traditional freedoms. So, yeah, I mean, you know, we often say that these wars are being fought to protect American freedom. Well, that's simply not true, right? No American freedom was ever at stake in Afghanistan or Iraq. So our servicemen are not fighting for American freedom over there. And ironically, freedoms are being diminished at home.
Absolutely.
In the name of fighting the war on terrorism. So it's like this odd thing. We're over there fighting for freedom, and yet our freedoms are being diminished at home. Well, no, we're not fighting for freedom over there, but yes, our freedoms are being diminished here at home. And people are really slow to see that connection, I think.
Right, I think that's true. You know, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Don.
At the end of that article, in about the last sentence, Phyllis Bennis talks about our responsibility in the face of all that. Do you have that there? And I just was struck by that because I was wondering, she says, our real obligation to the people of Iraq and the region and the rest of the world is to transform our government and our country so that these resource-driven wars shaped by lies and fought for power and for empire, whether in Iran or somewhere else, can never be waged again. And I thought that was a pretty good summary. But it also says to us, this is a long-term struggle. This isn't going to happen quick. But it's really the only thing that's going to stop these things in the future.
Right.
We have, you know, enormous structural forces here, right? I mean, we've got the economic interest, the oil and other resources, and the grand strategic plans for American domination and the use of military force in preventive wars. You know, so the Wolfowitz neocon kind of grand strategy here. So you've got those enormous structural forces that are pushing us toward these wars, but then those get tied in with a broad set of cultural forces. You know, this concept of American exceptionalism, this narrative, and it's a long-standing narrative that we are the best country in the world. We are a force for good, right? You've seen those ads on TV about the American Navy, the U.S. Navy, a global force for good.
Yes.
That's part of this narrative, right? That we have power, but we only use our power for good, right? And we are exceptional. We're the, you know, morally and politically, we have the best system. We're number one in every single category. And Americans don't fight wars for their own interests. We're not an empire. We seek to help the rest of the world. And of course, there's also a lot of evidence that lends some support to this. So our involvement in World War II, the good war, and our fight against Hitler and the obvious evils of fascism and the Japanese Imperial Army, you know, certainly if people come out of that era and that mindset, they see the U.S. in that way, in that role. And so it feeds that particular narrative. And so we have this broad narrative, and that supports then. So it makes it very, very difficult. You can try to expose the structural forces, but to overcome this cultural narrative of American exceptionalism. And I think that's so much part of the officials themselves, which allows them to normalize, in a sense, what they're doing. They don't see what they're doing as crimes. You know, George Bush and Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney, they did not see Iraq as a war, as a crime. And if they would be horrified by my explanation today that what they did was a crime and that they're war criminals. They simply don't see it. And they can't see it because they're so caught up in this narrative of American exceptionalism. They've so normalized their own actions within that particular story that they can't see it.
Right.
We from the outside, perhaps looking in, can point out their violations of international law and their manipulations of the intelligence and the lies that they told, but they don't see it from within their protected bubble, within their organizational and institutional structures. They don't see the world that way.
I think there's also a sense of, a part of that narrative is this sense of our moral superiority. And the disbelief that since we are the moral force in the world that we are, that we could do anything wrong.
Yep.
And yet we have. We have, in fact, left a country in shambles, and who knows how long it's going to take for that country to reconstruct itself. If there is any highlight out of it, I suppose, and this is something probably for another program because we're reaching the end, but certainly the peace movement in the United States during the time that we have been at war with Iraq certainly was a force. Millions of people across the world took to the streets and made a statement about what they thought about our involvement in
the other superpower.
The other superpower. Well, that brings us to the close. Gosh, we had a wonderful discussion this time. Nice, maybe not the right word, but a wonderful discussion. We look forward to having you with us next time, and we will see you at that time.